Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, hosted by me, Suzi Fay. It's not often I read a book that completely changes my way of viewing the world, and I'm not even kidding. I went to Tesco's, other supermarkets are available, of course, and I found myself utterly bemused by the floor. Elsewhere, I've been in coffee shops and looked very closely at the walls. Um, all will be explained. I'm going to be talking about this book, Painting in Stone. It's magnificent and magnificently heavy. And the author is with me now, or rather will be with me, coming at you from Rome. It's Fabio Barry. Hello, Fabio.
Hello, Suzi.
So, what do you think of my going to Tesco's and suddenly being absorbed by floor tiles? Because you realise that everywhere is faux marble.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you might also remember lino floors in hospitals or schools, where everything's green. And if you remember that, that green is the sort of color of consolation and so on. This has an extremely ancient tradition behind it, which you wouldn't be really aware of, nor was I actually until I had to come to write about it.
Exactly. So, I mean, you've looked into all this stuff. What's the meaning of everything that's around us, the meaning of the built environment.
Yeah, and also all those swanky bars you go to in London, with backlit alabaster, or even forgetting those, just looking at traditional buildings in London and also modern ones, because marble and stones and lithotypes have come back into fashion in a way they weren't in the 60s and 70s. In fact, I suppose their revival was in the 80s of the 20th century.
The book is subtitled Architecture and the Poetics of Marble from Antiquity to the Enlightenment. And I wondered if at any point when you were embarked on this project, you kind of thought everything that's ever been covered in marble or things that are painted to look like marble over thousands and thousands of years. I wondered if you ever thought, wow, this is quite a big topic for one book and one person.
Yes, it took quite a long time to write. In fact, it started because the point of departure was just somebody asking me to write an article for a German magazine, journal rather, in the 90s, and they had a week in which to fill a slot in a themed journal issue, which was about colour and architecture. And I'd always been really, I wouldn't say obsessed, but I was tickled by what I saw in Rome, because that's where I hang out the most, apart from England. And looking at all these extravagant marbled polychrome interiors and wondering what the hell they meant. And so I threw down a few ideas. I couldn't find anything in the existing literature that was very much help to me, very informative or inspired me very much. And so I wrote this article very quickly. And then eventually, I was an architect at the time. I ended up doing a PhD at Columbia, and I had lots of conventional subjects where I could have written a PhD about. But my advisor was on sabbatical that particular term. And so his replacement, the person who was going to look after me while he was away, said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I could do this thing about this cardinal and or this theme in Baroque architecture, which is the place I go to. And I'm very interested in coloured marbles. And this lady, unfortunately now deceased, said to me, whatever you do, it's going to be your calling card. And so I would go with the marbles if I were you. So that, that's new, that's different, which it was at the time. So I accepted her wisdom, and that's how the whole thing began. The original idea was just to write a book about the use of coloured marbles in the Baroque, so in the 17th century and the first half of the 18th century in Rome, centering on Gian Lorenzo Bernini And then the more I wrote about it, it became this real voyage back to my origins, actually, which were I'd originally entered university to be a classicist, and it just took me back to it. And I, reconceived this love for Latin and Greek literature, verse in particular, and then that was a jumping board for doing the rest of the research. And I'm also not somebody who can contain themselves very easily, or maybe get bored easily. I don't know. So I just kept branching out. The other thing was that I realized if I was trying to find evidence for my intuitions or perceptions into what I now regard as a marble culture, I had to look at a very long period of time. And that was because I was looking for texts. I was at the time, I thought you needed texts to prove to people that these ideas, these crazy ideas about marble really existed. So you couldn't do it in just one period. You had to look outside the period. And so I just kept looking and looking and looking. And as I did that, I realized it was a continuum of understanding. And then one thing fed the other.
I wondered whether just kind of growing up, you maybe sat in churches and looked around and thought, why does it look like this? Does it even go back as far as that, sort of being a bit bored during Mass?
Well, not during Mass, because Mass, I was an altar boy for a bit. You may not know this,
Right.
but
you were busy.
I was an altar boy in Epping, in Essex, so there wasn't much marble around. But I'm half Italian, and I used to come to Italy very frequently. And my father was a painter, and we'd get on the bus at sort of, 7 in the morning or 6 in the morning, and we'd come into Rome from the countryside. And the first stop on the Via 20 Settembre would be the Santa Maria della Vittoria, which is where there's a chapel designed by Bernini and with the statue sculpted by Bernini of Saint Teresa in ecstasy. And we'd go there, and we'd go for the first Mass in the morning. I don't remember, 7:30 maybe, with lots of smells and bells and the rest of it. And my father was as religious as I am, so little, I mean. We went there to be able to look at this chapel. He took me there to be able to look at this chapel. And so I knew it well, and I loved it, and I still love it. And every time I go back, it seems to question me. And the thing about the chapel is that everybody knows it from the statue, and very, very few people think about everything that surrounds it, which is this chapel and this whole environment painted with marbles. So I suppose that was the seed.
There's quite a lot of things that I did not know, and I discovered reading this book, and one of them rather shocked me, which is that St. Teresa, she doesn't have, is it a right arm? And
No.
also she's hollow like an Easter egg.
Yeah. No. Well, you wouldn't. It's the supremacy of the illusion that you wouldn't even think about it. Nor does she have a base, as I was at pains to point out in the book. She's meant to be an apparition, and it took all the skill of somebody like Bernini to make a miracle in religious fact, a miracle of art. So that's why you don't notice those things. And along with that is it's the desire to collapse all the dimensions of the various arts into a single plane of the imagination.
I want to go back. I mean, I have lots of questions about that period in particular and the churches of Rome, about which you're an expert. But I want to go back because we start much earlier than that, and you have very interesting things to say about Greek temples, and we sort of think of them not so much painted in stone as just white marble, purity. Can you kind of explain how the whole coloured marble thing came? I mean, do we have a true idea of Greek temples. And I think this is where you start with your idea that they're mediating places between heaven and earth. This idea begins, well, probably earlier, but it's certainly evident there.
Well, they're mediatory places, yeah, because they're places of invocation and sacrifice. And I was, of course, my focus was coloured marbles, but you can't really talk about coloured marbles without thinking about uncoloured marbles as well. Yeah, it would be a dereliction of duty. So, and also I just got more and more interested in the subject, and the subject took me to places that I either knew a little bit about or wanted to know more about. And so it took me back to Greek temples and white temples, because they're built in white marbles. And there's been, quite a lot of debate, and there still is, about how much Greco-Roman sculpture was coloured. That is, how much pigment was applied to it, and also temples, less so to temples. And so I looked at those, and the extraordinary efforts people went to quarry the materials to make them possible. And the origins of the practice aren't in architecture; they're in sculpture. They're in the Paros and Naxos and places like that. And they begin with people picking up stones which are weathered or being affected, field stones, right? So they're either stones lying on the ground or stones in riverbeds or something like that. And they begin to form effigies from them, so that's cycladic sculpture. And then at a certain point, many centuries later, they start building statues out of them, and then really big statues, in fact, statues the size of buildings or bigger even than the buildings that are available. And sculptural marble becomes architectural marble. And that was very interesting to me. I hadn't really realized that before, and I didn't know how many people do actually. And what recommended the stone, the marble in these Greek islands to the makers was they're not transparent, of course, but they're very, very reflective. They're very big crystals. They're to the eye like snow. Light enters to a certain point, is refracted and reflects, and so there's a magical quality to them. And then this extraordinary thing happens, which is people don't just start building temples out of them. I mean, out of blocks of stones that would have been otherwise used for statuary, but they make roofs out of them. And that was amazing to me. So at that point, it's not just how you build a building, it's the environment you create within it. And therefore, you start making buildings where when you enter, there's an environment of light which is filtered from natural light, but is recreated as an artificial or divine environment. So I was amazed by that. And then when I started looking at temples in Sicily, where say some of the best Greek temples in the Mediterranean are in fact in the Greek colonies in Sicily, I suddenly crossed my mind, well, they didn't actually have any marble quarries here. Nobody's quarrying marble at this time in Sicily or anywhere in Italy. But these temples built of local stones are covered with this beautiful stucco made of marble dust. And it struck my mind that it reminded me of a passage from 100 Years of Solitude, where everybody in this tiny town lost in the back and beyond, or in the middle of the jungle, I think it's described in the book, go to see the miracle of ice in a tent. And that's what it meant to me. That was that, well, how could you know, never having seen a block of marble in your life, what a temple meant? That was a local stone temple that's completely covered every single surface in a material that emulated a material you didn't know, emulated marble. So in the past, people used to say, of course, it's they're reflecting the origins of this kind of construction, and so they did it in Greece. It was done in marble. Therefore, in Sicily, it was done in marble. But people had never seen these damn things. So the shock is unimaginable, actually, of seeing something glistening, radiant. It's kind of beacon in the landscape. I don't know if I'm answering your question. I'm just riffing.
Yeah. Just riff. No, I mean the book is an extraordinary series of riffs, and we kind of, we leap through time. So if we move on, I'm going to do these terrible jumps, but if we move on to ancient Rome, there are tremendously entertaining passages about kind of column one-upmanship in Rome. And so what were people doing? There was this idea that it was sort of not just vulgar to put columns in your home, but somehow presumptuous.
Well, that's all true. Most of the literature up until a certain point will concentrate on the criticisms that were made of the luxury of using marble in Rome. And it began with homes rather than temples. And there's a memorable passage about dragging columns to make a house in front of the temples, which were still tufa temples covered in stucco with terracotta statues in their pediments and so on. And so this seemed to be to conservative observers an affront to the gods. And certainly you've got two things happening, really. You've got the Romans leaving Italy, spreading across the Mediterranean, conquering Greece, conquering any damn thing they can find in their way. Eventually, didn't take them too long, reaching Egypt and the luxury of Egypt. And the second thing is actually becoming heir to everything that Hellenistic Greece was, to everything that Alexander brought back from his travels to the what we now call the Middle East, but all the way to India, and being heir to a culture that already existed, actually, which was communications not only across the Mediterranean, but also almost as far as India. And so the Romans took all of that on board, and the conservative commentators who have the luxury of being the best remembered or the most cited, at least, revile this pollution of the sacred waters, the pure waters of Roman citizenship, and these myths of them being a warrior race and Cincinnatus with his plough and so on. So these writers react against this. Sometimes when they're reacting against a historical tradition, their targets are actually they're Nero and people like this. But it became a kind of mantra, oh my God, look out, we're even, people now are just covering everything with marble, and the aristocracy have really just gone too far. We've lost the soul of our culture. Actually, sort of comments that are quite familiar today in different versions. They're conservative comments. So I looked at those because they're the most quoted. But I was what became more obvious to me as I did the research was and what became more interesting is what the poets said about the marbles, and therefore you got the eye of the poet, and poetry is the hard currency of the imagination, and that's what I look to.
You talk quite a lot about, I think it's pronounced ekphrasis, poetry about buildings or about artworks. And in a lot of cases, if a building has not survived, what we have is these descriptions, these beautiful descriptions. But what were they intended to be at the time? Were they for armchair travelers who couldn't actually go and see this wonderful building, or were they kind of somehow part of the building itself?
Well, a lot of them are panegyrical, so they're praise or blame texts. Very often, if you think of somebody like Statius or somebody like that, or even people who are apparently conservative, they are a way of praising the patron through the building. So, and that's a cause, it's an incipit for launching into not terribly long descriptions, but a few verses on the virtues of the marbles, transparency, lucidity, their poikilia, their colourfulness, wherein colourfulness is a virtue of multifariousness or something like that, and that the marbles then literally reflect upon the patron who had let's not beat it around the bush, the financial wherewithal to actually create these environments. There's also, I think, subtending this idea that these are luminous homes and palaces which make either the patron luminous or derive their luminosity from the luminous virtue of the patron themselves. So, I think I've probably answered the first part of your question, but not the second.
Well, I was wondering, whether the verses kind of travelled far and wide, and people used them to find out about wonderful things that they would never be able to actually go and see.
Oh, yes, yeah. Thank you for reminding me. That's a good point. Indeed, they did travel, and they're still with us, in some sense. So yes, verse in particular. In fact, I think it's, as I think it's poetry, in my opinion, that's the main conduit for understanding architecture before you get descriptive novels and that sort of thing in the end of the 18th century. Yes, they're conduits. I mean, they're conduits for a number of reasons. They're authoritative visions of buildings because they're dedicated to authorities. But at the same time, the words remain, the buildings don't. And these descriptions of buildings become the figments of later poets and imaginations and builders. That's, in many cases, that's all they have to rely on, because the ruins have been. You come to Rome, as you know yourself, the buildings have been stripped of everything that made them wondrous in the eyes of those poets in antiquity. So it's literature, verse in particular, that becomes the memory of these visions, and therefore affords the visions for later people, whether they're poets or architects or painters, and these figments travel.
The different sorts of stone that we're talking about, and you have all these wonderful names for them, including one that seems to be almost like red onion, but yeah. I wondered, in the context of ancient Rome, whether they represented empire itself. Sort of, they brought them from far and wide. So if you had these pillars, they would be a symbol for Rome's dominance.
Well, undoubtedly they did at the beginning, and it's been pointed out many times that to go into a building covered with marbles from every quarter of the empire made it a mineral map of said empire, especially to the imaginations of people who couldn't travel as easily as we can do today. I didn't have any quarrel with that. As I pointed out in the book, there's got to be a point where that impact wears off, and it can't be the only guide to understanding why you have this multiplicity of stones. So yeah, I don't disagree with it. I just think it's just the beginning of an answer.
Yeah. I mean, the arguments that you make in the book about the movement through to religious architecture, which is the bulk of the book, how we move from Roman domestic interiors to early churches and temples, and how churches are put together, is such a complicated story. And if we sort of whiz through a bit, you go into quite a lot of detail later on in sort of theological meanings embodied in buildings. I think if people are not familiar with Catholic churches, you might just go in and go, wow, there's a lot of stuff here. You know, this is a bit maximalist. And actually, you unpick a lot of this. I wondered whether the architects, I don't know if we're going to rush as far as Borromini and Bernini, if the architects are working under quite high level theological discussion and debate, or whether everybody thought stone meant this, that stone meant that, and light meant something else.
Well, they didn't have geological categories, and it's not about whether it's an architect or a patron or to do with theology or a knowledge of geology or the sciences as we call them now. It's to do with what one could contentiously call shared perceptions about how stones are formed, and or really what constitutes the natural world around you. And if you're a Christian, so let's forget Catholicism for one moment. If you're a Christian, you know the world is made by God. You know everything is some kind of artifact of God. And then further to that, there's the idea of the incarnation of God in the world. And how, so the incarnation in itself, is quite a complex issue. So how does a God become man? And how does divinity, how does that thing way, way beyond you become incarnated in the world? And what are its phenomena and what's left behind? And how does it represent itself? So the main thing is the world begins in light, God is light, and the world will actually also end in light. So the quotient for divinity to some extent is the inclusion of light. And if you look at a gem or a diamond, it glitters, it's a stone, it's very, very hard, but you're amazed by this inclusion of light in it. And then below diamonds, there's all sorts of hierarchies of other things that are filled with light, and until light dims totally and you're down to the mud and so on. And so the idea of divinity being present in the world seems to be embodied in materials by their inclusion of light. Marble's sort of, somewhere down the pole from diamond, and it manifests an image of earth because you can see images of self-evident images of generation in stones and their swirling and their mineral inclusions and so on. But you can polish them, and in that surface slick, you seem to recover this divine light.
I was interested to read about, there's something I will never forget now that you've pointed it out, which is book matching, which again is something that's absolutely everywhere. So just explain book matching.
Well, book matching, should I get a book off the shelf? Here we go. So if you take a piece of marble like this and you saw it down the middle and open it up, you'll get book matching. In this case, not symmetrical. But if you open up a block of stone, of course, the veins will be symmetrical. And you can do this. So that's book matching, the simple version. Then you can open it up the other way, and then you can open it up other ways, and you'll get continuously symmetrical patterns because the veining runs through the stone, of course, and it diminishes as it runs through the stone. And this is considered to be a Byzantine. It's best known as a technique of Byzantine architecture, but it was already done in antiquity for sure. We don't really know from physical remains before the 2nd century AD, I suppose, of book matching in architecture. I'm thinking of the hanging houses at Ephesus, but it's certainly imitated in painting. So, and I believe it's predates that. I think I've seen examples of it on Crete in Minoan architecture with alabaster paneling, and it's a very interesting thing. Book matching it's not particularly. I mean, it sort of derives from the practice. You open a block, so it's already apparent to you. You could stick those two slabs side by side, but it becomes a way of reconciling all the kind of chaos of marble veining into a structure just by symmetry, just by simply cutting the block. And then there's the implication of infinite repetition. So you can go fourfold, you can go accordion, as I call it. It's a potentially infinite structure. Actually, it's like any tessellation. You can go for infinity, and I don't think the potential of it was really exploited in the Roman era, but it certainly was in the Byzantine era, in Hagia Sophia most notably, but not only, and in the floor most notably, now covered over, of course. But it suggested something, well, we know it was made by hands, we know it was cut by hands, but it suggests a natural structure that can go on forever. And that's a very interesting thing to apply to the surface of something built by people.
How far did you travel for this? I mean, not just for this book, but generally, these ideas have been coming to you for years and years. So did you travel to Istanbul?
Yeah,
Old Byzantium.
several times, and you can't do these things from books. You have to go and see the things and react to them and intuit, what they're about, because not only was there precious literature to go on in terms of how do I think about marble when I began this, but everybody's eyes are different, and you have to go there and be under the sun, have a glass of wine or whatever is required, have an open mind, certainly, and then have a reaction which some people think is poetic. I just think it's human. And to be able to return to your computer, your white page, and start to write down ideas about it. And more often than not, when I was doing this, I'd have an idea and I think, well, I wonder if that will fly. And then not the next day, probably 2 months, 6 months later, I'd find a poem where, a wonderful Greek Byzantine poem where somebody had written something far more poetic than I'd intuited. And that became a text, that became a document for the book. But writing the book, I began to distrust this division between there being an artwork and a document for it, because it makes the literature subservient to the visualities of art. So it took me in all sorts of directions.
Can you talk a little bit about the Capella Gregoriana, which is, and again, it's sort of later, isn't it? We're talking,
it's 1580.
yeah, but it's very significant, isn't it? Within St. Peter's itself, it seems to hold a very special fascination for you.
Well, it has, to the extent that there's a book coming out, in fact, right now. Well, not right now. It's been accepted by a well-known press, Brepols, which has had a meeting about it yesterday. And that book is about co-authored by me and Paul Gwynn, which is about literary responses to the Capella Gregoriana in St. Peter's, and of which there are very important and pretty much unknown books in prose and verse in Latin, so it's Neo-Latin, and commissioned for the occasion, for the inauguration of this chapel. And why is this chapel important? Okay, it's built by Pope Gregory XIII. It's the very first chapel built in New St. Peter's while the old nave was still standing. It's the very first part of New St. Peter's that was finished at all. So when this chapel was finished, there was a big empty crossing with no dome on top of it, with pigeons flying around and water dripping over the walls, and so on. This church that we see today, and this is kind of behemoth, and destination for Catholics, if not indeed Christians, was just like a ruin. And Pope Gregory decided he was going to finish this chapel, and his excuse was that he was going to bring a body of a Greek church father, Gregory of Nazianzus, over his namesake and bury it in this chapel. And this would be some sort of incentive for reconciliation between the Latin church and the Greek church. That's sort of kind of the politics behind it. And what's created is a chapel the size of a pretty large church. It's the biggest dome in Rome at the time, 1580, when it's finished. The only bigger dome, and it's only because it's wider, not because it's taller, is the Pantheon, which was the man to beat in Rome.
Yeah.
And it's completely covered in marble from the floor, including the floor to the cornice, and everything above that is mosaic, a technique that hadn't been used in Rome for, what, let's see, 400 years. Okay, it's completely obsolete technique. And the mosaic of the dome, of course, being made of tesserae, which is stone, as well as glass with gold in the back of them, is a lithic technique. So the whole idea, there are smaller pieces too, but they're small fry in this building. The whole idea is to make something that's completely, a lithic creation. And it must have just blown people's socks off, because there wasn't anything to compare with it. And there wasn't anything since antiquity. And the shock of that is what created the literature around it. So that's why I'm interested in it. I wasn't so interested in it when I wrote the book, because I wasn't really interested in where does this thing begin, or, I was more interested in Bernini and what he does with an established medium, because he does very revolutionary things. He takes a stone which is colorful, shiny, imperial, shouts authority at you, the authority of tradition, and he makes it into a painterly medium. That's already a kind of germ in the Cappella Gregoriana, but the ambition of that building is so great. We're totally blind to it today, because you walk into St. Peter's, you wouldn't have an idea, because it's a template for the rest of St. Peter's. They just copied the vocabulary, extended it to the rest of Basilica. You walk in, you pass by it, you wouldn't know.
And because the whole building is a continuum, you just walk through spaces the whole time, and it is another of those spaces.
Indeed. Yeah. So space continuum. It was nothing, it was never intended to be that. I mean, the chapel was fenced off by bronze balustrades, very high balustrades with gates at the beginning, and all the corner chapels were meant to be too. But it grew the basilica, and then it grew a taste for this kind of polychrome stone architecture in Rome, and domes as well, by the way. That's the reason, one of the reasons Rome is the most bedomed city in Europe. And then it spread everywhere else. I mean, it spread to Paris, spread to Berlin, or even in Bavaria, where they didn't have the marbles that were available in Rome. They imitate them or they simulate them. So it's the birth of a pan-European phenomenon.
Is it always a question of what you've got to hand in terms of how styles are copied, or is it a question of who's got the deepest pockets and who can really swank about bringing something amazing, vast distances to adorn whatever?
Bringing things vast distances was quite important. There's a point in the Middle Ages where stones were relics. So to bring a piece of stone from Rome, or many pieces of stone, to Aachen or somewhere like that, was particularly important, because they came with the aura of sanctity. They also came with the aura of the imperial, and so on. And there's a thing that's dear to my heart, which I'm briefly mentioning in the book, which is one Harpin of Thornley, I think, who comes down to Rome and then goes back on a donkey all the way to Durham with a piece of porphyry. So I'm going to stretch back for this, probably that long. And I didn't find this piece of porphyry in Durham, but it is recorded. And imagine taking that trip on a donkey, from Rome. Yes, I'm not talking about EasyJet.
Poor donkey.
And also a piece of stone like this piece of porphyry became portable altars. They were literally portable. They were the altars that you could still Catholic priests do. Various sizes can take into your home to say a mass, make your house into a chapel, and so on. So materially, there's that kind of translation, which is the right word for it, in fact. But more important than that is actually the persistence of the idea and the travel of the idea. Yeah, sure, people didn't have the money. They didn't have the money, but they imitate it. They imitate marble in paint. They imitate it in fresco. And when you get to fresco, they're not just imitating it. They're kind of reconstituting it, because fresco is a synthesized form of stone. It's made of lime. You have paints made of earth. They sink into the lime, plaster. The whole thing becomes solid. It becomes an amalgam. It's reconstituted stone. So they knew that. If I know that, they knew it. So the image travels in literature. There's memory, speech, conversation, whatever. There's no end of the means of transition, really, besides the material.
And there's another aspect, many aspects to the book. I mean, one is, as you've just touched on, stones that are literally relics in themselves. So there's the fascinating story of the flagellation pillar, which is in Rome, and I think we saw it together. Isn't it near a church? Isn't it in a church near Termini Station?
I'm wondering. Santa Bibiena probably is what you're talking about. Yeah, it's one of the flagellation pillars.
Right.
There are many. Of course, there are competitions for authenticity here, which I won't comment on.
Right.
But there was simulation. I was actually interesting you asked this, because probably about 6 hours ago, I was sitting with a guy in a bar in Rome, a brilliant PhD student who was telling me about his researches into the pillar of flagellation. And he was telling me stuff I didn't know at all, which was about wooden painted columns of flagellation, which were used by flagellant communities. And this explained a lot about Duecento and Trecento painting, which none of it, all news to me. And I'm encouraging him very strongly to publish this. But in terms of the actual stone relics that people claim to be pillars of the flagellation,
and there's a birthstone, isn't there?
Oh, there's lots. I mean,
lots.
There's a family of stones to do with the history of the Virgin, the history of Christ. There's also the pillar of parturition, which the Virgin leaned against in the cave of the Nativity as she gave birth to Christ. The column of pillars that are angels have become columns. Also in the Grotto of the Nativity, also in Hagia Sophia. I don't remember, to tell you the truth right now. There's plenty of them. It requires a more systematic study than I made myself. There were columns where you could see the finger marks left by Saint Sebastian. I can't remember now. Clenching the pillar at his martyrdom. There are many, many, many. The places where people interpreted marks in columns and associated it with a passio of a saint. And then this whole, upper tier of Christ relics. But there's many. There's a really nice one in Bologna. It's black marble. There's one in Jerusalem, of course. There's plenty. There's plenty of fragments of them.
And they use natural markings in the stone. Sort of. There's I can't remember which one it is, but it seems to have it has milk from the Virgin Mary and maybe blood as well.
It's the Grotto of Nativity. Yeah, that's not a column. I think that's the
slab.
I think yeah. No, that one. Yeah, no, that's the that's gone missing. There's a fragment of it apparently survives, which I think I illustrated in the book.
Is it in a little relic
Yeah.
holder?
That's part of a slab that was on top of the sepulchre, so the sarcophagus of, if I'm not wrong, Manuel Comnenus, a Byzantine emperor in the Imperial Chapel next to the Pantocrator Church in Constantinople, which still stands. Fantastic church. The slab's no longer there. It was broken up, after the Ottoman takeover of Constantinople and then the loss of relics. Yes, and that was a stone that, as you pointed out, that was particularly important because it was a stone that Christ laid on, and there was a consistent reception by pilgrims at the sort of glassy increments in this overwhelmingly reddish pink stone. These little increments in the stone were the tears of the Virgin as she wept over the prostrate Christ that had entered the stone and become frozen in it, from which you get things like Mantegna's very famous painting, maybe not famous to all your listeners, but they'll certainly
the foreshortened one.
Yes, the foreshortened one in the Brera,
yeah.
Where you see these, these figures, the Mary and the Virgin and Mary Magdalene, almost like figures from Picasso's Guernica, with their sorrow deeply etched into their faces, shedding copious tears onto the stone. And you look at this stone, and Mantegna obviously knew very well, without having been able to see it firsthand, all the lore about what this stone meant, because it's not only as red and as you imagined a stone infused with the blood of Christ to be, but it has these veins like droplets.
I want to sort of take a little sideways move here. I mean, there are many aspects of the book that have a weird resonance today. To be rather flippant, people saw images in stones when they were cut, religious images. And it reminded me a lot of people who sort of toast a piece of bread and say there's an image of Jesus on it, sort of reading into things from images, reading into images. And another aspect that you touch on, and I guess there's a lot of literature about this elsewhere, is the occult properties of stones, which was not entirely separated from Christian thought. The idea of the influence of the stars. We now see these things as very separate. But back in some of the times you were talking about, there was this movement, a very easy movement between thinking about the influence of the stars and the properties of stone, and how that related into the use of stone in a building.
Well, I don't know if it's so divorced in our consciousness. I think things that we would have said 20 or 30 years ago were New Age ideas, birthstones and that sort of thing. They seem to be more and more current as I look around. I can't speak as an expert on it. And they are astral, so they're stones that people associate with planets, at least. So that exists for sure. Without my intervention, that exists in the modern world.
Yeah, it's like crystal therapy and
yeah. But there's also a lot of lithotherapy. In fact, there's a lot of things that a lot of properties that people attribute to stones. Generally speaking, not necessarily marbles. And when I spoke about it in the book, I was talking about hard stones and gems, because that's actually, it has to be things that have a sufficient quotient of light for them to tell you they're divine, that they could act upon you and be a medium or vehicle for this otherworldly influence, which is the conjunction of the planets or whatever it is. So when I spoke about it, I talked about it as being by analogy. So I don't think I've ever found a text where people said if you stick if you hang a sort of plate of marble around your neck, you're gonna be fine. But there's a sliding scale. There's not this kind of categorization or taxonomy of stones in the Middle Ages or antiquity, or even the 17th or 18th centuries that now exist today, where we differentiate between them, and talk about gems versus, sandstone or something, and what comes in between. So it's difficult to find some kind of foundational text which would, what I could find, I cited, where people talk about these things in this way. But it's not really a leap of thought that if you carry a hard stone, which appears to be a marble in miniature, that you might feel that larger stones share these properties. So, and certainly without even thinking about, the astrophysics of sympathetic magic, green itself was a curing color, and was good for your the eye, and good for optics. So that's one of the enduring reasons that green marbles, Cipollino in particular, end up being green lino in libraries, to this day, or hospital walls,
Yes. Well, there's a book recently called Magus by Anthony Grafton, where he looks at the figure of the Magus, who we now think of as John Dee talking to angels and drawing up horoscopes, but he takes a wider view, and it does sort of overlap with some of these themes in your book, that engineers themselves were sort of seen as miracle workers or magicians, kind of working under powers that came from God. It seems to be there's a little overlap here.
Well, there would be, because when I was a graduate student at Columbia in 1997, Tony Grafton was a visiting professor doing a seminar on, I don't know if it was called this, but a lot of it was about sympathetic magic. And I was one of the students there, and he was an enormous influence on me. He opened my eyes to lots of things. So if there's any overlap, thanks, Tony.
It goes right back, right back to that. Can we talk a little bit about there's so many amazing illustrations, there are lots and lots of reproductions of paintings, there are lots of your own photographs. Back cover is this amazing thing. You'd have to travel far and wide to actually look a lot of the things in this book, but that is an image of something, I believe, that is in London.
Yeah, it's near to home. Yeah, it's in Westminster Abbey. Yeah, it's not my image, clearly, because although I had considered abseiling, it wouldn't allow me. And I had 2 sets of photos for that, because I had pre and post restoration, and they sent me a great photo. I got, I think, even better photo for the front, which was, that's a tiny detail. It's difficult to believe that's a detail of a much, much larger photo taken by a fantastic photographer in Rome, who gave it to me for free. He said, "I've done this for another project, and you can have it." And without that, I think it would, not half the book, but it would have diminished it. Yeah, I took photos wherever I could, and they were taken over many years. And I started off with a DSLR slide film, and a lot of the slide film photos are in there because slide film was amazing. Then when we went digital, I took digital photos, and in the end I found out they weren't so great. So a lot of those photos were swapped out in the last couple of months with iPhone photos, actually, because they could capture light better, and they would equalize tonalities and color and whatever. And I took them through Photoshop, a bit of that. So you're dependent on what you're using to capture images, and it wouldn't have looked, the book would not have looked as good as it does. I think it does. Most people like the look of it. If it hadn't been for my wife, Pele Cox, who'd had a fair amount of publishing experience, and she just said this, I like the text, but the photos are going to look great. And she went for every damn one. And I think we spent about 3 months trying to get the photos right, and she was the ultimate arbiter. And I trusted her because she wasn't me, and she has a very good eye.
But yes, you're the first husband and wife team to appear on Book Bag, and your efforts were very well rewarded. You won several prizes, and without explaining why I have this, I'm going to reveal something.
Why do you have
that? I must have nicked it.
Yeah.
But this is the Architectural Book of the Year Awards 2023. Fabio Barry is the winner of one of the history category for painting in stone. And that was awarded by the Worshipful Company of Chartered Architects. And I was indeed at this. I think it stuck to my sticky fingers.
Yes,
you handed it to me to hold and I kept it. But you can have it back. But it was actually at Temple Bar. It was the most amazing setting.
Yeah. Suzi, I want you to treasure that.
Oh, okay. I might frame it up and put it somewhere in my little book bag studio. Yeah. So, well, yes, cosmati floors. What?
Cosmati.
It's a floor. It's a floor, and I guess you can't walk on it. It's very precious, isn't it?
Well, it's privileged people can walk on it, as they do, every time there's a coronation.
Like kings and things, yeah.
Yeah, that sort of stuff. What I love about that floor, apart from it being a beautiful floor, is that it's the only cosmati floor. There are many, many that I'm aware of that has an inscription on it explaining its symbolism. And they brought the stone from Italy, of course. They're all reused classical stones. They're all recycled. And it was an Italian team that came up to London to lay them in the floor. And they wrote out this fantastic description of how the floor is macro and microcosmic. They didn't do that anywhere else. So they must have done it there because they were desperate for the English, and this is pre-Brexit English, of course, to understand what the hell it meant.
How old is it?
How old is it? I know, look up the date on the book. Very old.
Oh, okay. Right, okay. I mean, we're not...
13th century. I can't remember.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it wasn't put in the year 2000 or anything like that. No. So does cosmati mean of the cosmos, kind of?
No, it's a family name. It's a family name.
Oh, okay.
It's derived from Cosmos, basically, and his scions. So it's a family workshop that gave their name, or that the name was given by historians later on to this whole style of making floors and revetments.
Right, let me just look at my I'm just going to look at my notes to see if there's anything I've missed. Oh yes, there's something linked to the cosmati floors, which is the floors that appeared to be like the sea.
Oh yeah.
And that has a sort of theological meaning as well, doesn't it? Are these tessellated floors or marble floors?
They're not tessellated. They are a series. So, as opposed to what you've just shown us, they are floors made up of a series of conjoined slabs rather than this kind of mosaic work. And the most famous example of this is in Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, and they are made of Proconesian marble. So this marble that has, if you cut it the right way, so if you cut it on the bias, so you don't get straight veining, you get this kind of wavy veining. And it's a sort of lovely bluey grey, or as Ruskin called it, dove grey colour. And they are set, each one next to another, in book-matched patterning, which increases the idea of there being waves. And I wrote an article called Walking on Water many years ago now, which is a chapter in that book, which was me trying to understand why people for centuries had said this floor of Hagia Sophia looks like the sea, and then turned to other churches which used the same or similar or analogous kind of flooring and talked about them as the seeds. So I went through all this, and I came up with the conclusion that the floor is materially representing the chaos, the deep, which is watery, from which everything arises. So the origin of all things. And at the same time, it's representing the end of all things, which is the throne room of the Lord at the end of time, where his throne, surrounded by angels blowing trumpets and the rest of it, and he's on a crystal throne, is overlies a crystal sea. And these are all from quotations in the Gospels and the Old Testament and the Apocrypha, and everybody else who cared to comment on the good book, from the peoples of the book. It's not purely Christian. Ever after. So Jewish commentaries, and certainly Arabic ones as well. And there's an extraordinary culture of glassy or sea floors, which extends to India. And in fact, quite recently, a young, interesting sculptor in India Zoomed me, and we talked about a floor in a 19th century palace somewhere in Rajasthan. I'm not quite sure where yet, where the floor was actually made up of mirrors. So it's about 1840. So there's an incredible continuum of this, and in that case, probably through the Islamic tradition. And this interested me very much. Why do you want to make a floor which subverts itself? You always think of walking on ground, the earth under your feet, and so on. So my hypothesis, which seems to have been well accepted to the point of being repeated quite frequently, sometimes without total understanding, sometimes without recognition, is that this is an allusion to this. So when you tread on this floor, it's not about you being on the earth. It's about your being in eternity, really, because the floor is comprises, brackets, the alpha and omega of all things. And I said all that, and if you want to know more about it, read the book or the article. I'm not sorry if it sounds purple, because I don't know a better way of summing up the enormity of the implications of putting down a material like that under your feet. By the way, just sorry to interrupt. Quite recently, maybe a couple of years ago, that chapter is called "Walking on Water," as was the original article. Somebody sent me an email which said the tagline was "Walking on Carpet," and they sent me the photos of the interior of Hagia Sophia, which is now a mosque. It's no longer a museum, with all of that covered up with carpet. So those of us who saw it before are privileged to have seen it, and it has a prehistory of being covered with carpet since 1453 until the 19th century. So there was a kind of porthole in the existence of that floor where people like me could look at it and wonder, and that's been closed again until the next chapter.
Until the next time. Well, when you get to the end of the book, and as it says, it goes through to the Enlightenment, you almost have a "we'll stop there" moment. And I wondered whether, the story goes on. And indeed, in the epilogue, you look at a few modern buildings and modern uses of things like book matching. Is there ever going to be another volume, or have you moved on to a different topic entirely?
I've moved on to different topics entirely. I keep getting asked to do things on Marble, and I keep doing them. And there's always, there's an infinity of things I didn't cover. And I did think when I finished the book, now I should go and write another one, which wouldn't be about global use of stones. It would really be about marbles and modernity. But I didn't think I need to do that. There's plenty of other people who could do it, and I'm interested in other things now.
So can you tell us what your next project is, or is it a secret?
No, it's not a secret at all. What I never work on one thing at the same time. I always work on about 5 or 6. They're like regiments. It's like Waterloo. They're regiments moving forwards, and then one decides to charge, or they get attacked and they have to counterattack. Which is a publishing deadline or something. So I've got several things on the boil, and I'm not going to bore you with all of them, but one thing I've been working on for quite a long time is the tholos, so the idea of why temples are around from antiquity through until the 18th century. And that's the most interesting parts of that are really to do with distant antiquity and Greco-Roman antiquity so far. So that's one. The only reason that's come into being was because I started writing a book arrogantly about, I thought I'll just write a history of the dome, there isn't one. And so that's a thing that chugs along. And then an offshoot of that, so the reason that the tholos thing came into being was I thought I'll just do this short chapter at the beginning, which is what happened with the marble book. I think, I'll just do the Baroque, but then I'll do an introduction, which turns into 11 chapters or something. So so I'm continuing with the dome because, at heart, really, origin, I'm a Baroque person. I'm an early modern architectural person, and I've got a hell of a lot to say about Baroque architecture, but I keep sort of being pulled off in another direction. So there's that. And then the big thing I'm doing at the moment is architecture and poetry, and that's consuming me. So that's what I'm interested in pushing forward right now as a book, as many books, as organizing a project amongst scholars. And this is because it seems to me that poetry has been discounted as a genre of literature, and maybe even high literature generally, in understanding architecture, and it's an untapped reservoir. So I'm coming up with lots of sources that have been ignored for that, and they're in the many thousands. I'm pushing a project on this, and at the same time, all the while I'm doing that, I'm not just looking for primary sources. I'm asking myself, what the hell is poetry? Which I keep asking everybody, including you, in fact. And I realize
it's all about the end of the line. It's all about the end of the line and where it.
Well, I realized it was the wrong question. The question isn't what is poetry. It's an idle question. It's like the sort of paroxysms you'd induce if you ask people what's art, and you go from the banalities of, somebody spouting about high art to somebody saying art is whatever you feel is done, with an artistic intention, which is not necessarily untrue, but it's flatlining the question. And what is poetry is a similarly idle question. The real question is, why is poetry necessary as a form of expression? What occasions it? What are the conditions that make poetry necessary? So while I'm writing about architecture, and I want to know why pre-modernity poetry was actually the most informative, most imaginative, most descriptive form of explanation of architecture. Forget treatises, they're dull as ditch water. What that comports is to try and understand what poetry is. And that's probably will occupy me till my death. But I'm glad the question is one I finally posed myself.
Let's move on to my final questions. And when I have somebody who is very involved in the literary world, I don't ask them what their favorite book is. I ask them what their favorite artwork is, because book is just there's just too many. So I don't really know what to do with you, Fabio. I don't know whether to ask for a favorite artwork or a favorite book, or both, or maybe they're ridiculous questions, both of them, but have a think.
Well, they're invidious questions. I would say,
Meant to be.
they, of course, if I had to pick a book off the top of my head that stayed with me, well, of course, it would be impossible to say, but it would probably be 100 Years of Solitude or something like that, because it's a fixture in my imagination, and it made me understand a lot about myself, because I know it's magic realism and it's nothing to do with Italy, but it made me understand a lot about my displacement from the culture I grew up in, which was in England. So I'm very fond of it, even though I haven't read it for 30 years. And there are many, many more meritable books. If it were a work of art, of course, it would be impossible for me to say, the work of art would always be what I was most interested in that moment. But there is one work of art, which is the Cornaro Chapel by Bernini, that amazes me. Every time I walk back, it's as though it's asking me a question. It can't be otherwise. Every time I go in there, I see something new, and it's not. I don't feel it's my eye, cold eye on the object. I feel it's the object's interaction with me. So, as much as I hate to say it, that would be the one.
Is that the St. Teresa?
Yes,
Chapel?
that is the St. Teresa Ecstasy Chapel. All of it, everything. It's a world.
Yeah. Yes, I've been lucky enough to go round Rome in your company, and it's really extraordinary what you bring out of a building. But I remember it must have been last year, I arrived first because I was staying in a hotel, and you just said meet at this church, and I just went into this quite ordinary looking church on a busy street. And that the first thing I saw, I was obviously familiar with the artwork, but I'd never seen it. And it's drama, it's everything, it's like a vortex pulling you in. It's
and more it reminds me, I was saying this to somebody actually last night, was that the first time I went into the Palazzo delle Esposizioni in Rome, which is one of the sort of big exhibition halls, and I walked in off the street as many years ago, and I thought, well, why not? I'll go and see this modern installation. And I walked in to the upper story, and it's very, very high rooms, and there were these enormous videos of people walking through fire or on fire, and it turned out to be Bill Viola, who's recently died, whom I knew nothing about at the time. And my experience of seeing the Bill Viola videos is what I most associate with seeing the Cornaro Chapel. It's just it defeats standing back and looking at things, at objects. It's a confrontation, but in no aggressive way. It sucks you into it, and I'm not going to say you're faced with your own mortality, but you confront it, and it confronts you, certainly.
You have these juxtapositions in the book, because I remember there's one not enough, but there's one about that weather installation in the turbine hall that you compare directly with Hagia Sophia. And there's another one about a light installation with fluorescent tubes, which you compare to Greek columns. So you're really making this continuum of ideas and art inspiration, which is amazing, I think. Okay, so sorry.
I didn't do it enough.
Right. Well, that's for another book, maybe. So 100 Years of Solitude is right up there, but do you have a book of shame that you are embarrassed to say you have not read yet?
Well, the list is too long. Unfortunately, I have found myself for many years in a situation where I read on a need-to-know basis, which is shameful. I don't read for pleasure even, I read to feed my curiosity about the problems of the moment. It's terrible. And so the books I haven't read could fill the shelves behind me many times over. But if I had to pick one, I suppose it would be Ulysses.
Right. Yes. People do tend to go for Ulysses. they don't tend to go for Finnegan's Wake, and I don't think anybody feels any shame about not reading Finnegan's Wake. I saw something recently about a notice in a bookshop in Dublin that says, if we catch you shoplifting, we'll make you read Ulysses, and if we catch you twice, we'll make you read Finnegan's Wake. So yeah, poor old James Joyce. He's getting a lot of mentions. I don't think there's anything about stone in it or marble. It's grimy Dublin streets. Yeah, nothing for you in that book. And finally, have you ever had any funny or bizarre feedback on your work, which can come from any direction?
Yeah, no, I've had quite a bit actually. There's 2 or 3 cases come to mind. If you want to hear them all, I'll tell you. But the first one that comes to mind is because you mentioned the thing about flaws, and originally that came out as an article, and to acclaim, people loved it, and thank God. But it was about as I mentioned earlier, it was about the conjoined book match slabs to the floor and this bluey grey marble and how it conjured the sea, and there's a whole discussion about how this is elemental and so on. And shortly after that came out, I got a message on Facebook, I think, from a guy who was the president of the Fender Stratocaster Society or whatever it was, and he said, hey man, I've read this article, it's really cool. And he sent a photo of the back of one of these guitars, electric guitar, which they're rosewood, and the veneer on the back, of course, is book matched, as it is. Book matching is you get in furniture and cabinetry and whatever. And he wrote to me and said, I really, he grooved to the I can't remember the words that way. He really loved the argument, and he said he asked me if we could write a joint article about book matching on the veneers of these electric guitars, because I'd written only about water as an element and divinity and marble, whereas we together could write about rosewood veneering and fire, because it's red. And hey, the whole thing's electric too,
Well, yes. I mean, to go back to what I said right at the beginning, painting in stone just makes you look at the world in a new way. I mean, the ideas of decorating interiors and exteriors just is all around us. Color is all around us. Fake stone, faux marbling. I mean, I remember the days when do you remember when there was that fashion to sort of do sort of stippling and marbling on your own walls at home with kind of sponges? And we've got crystal therapy, as I've said, star signs. I mean, it's really quite amazing what you've brought together in this wonderful book, Painting in Stone. Wonderful back cover, wonderful front cover, heavy as anything, and this is only the paperback, but very well done, Fabio Barry, and we'll look forward to hearing much more from you on poetry and architecture. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzi.
Get back to Rome. Surely it must be Negroni time by now.
Yeah.
Oh, he's gone. No, yeah, go and have a Negroni. Anyway,
I'll take your advice.
Please do. My advice is always worth taking. So fabulous to talk to Fabio Barry. Fabulous, Fabio. Join me in the book bag next time. I shall find somebody else, maybe not as erudite and wide-ranging as the discussion that we have just had, but I'll find another author for you very soon. So thank you very much for watching. Goodbye. And I shall stop recording.
Yeah, so I started writing this book really quite a number of years ago. And in that dates, I like days of the week and, months and things in a book. And there's this sort of general despair with the kind of holes that exist in ancient material. There's nothing I can do about that. There's nothing that any author, ancient history you often have years you don't know what's happening. You're playing with gaps. And like, to me as a writer, I find this interesting and quite creative, because it's how you connect and how you get around this. But there are people who still, I think you might get a review or something by someone who is a historian working in a much later period, and they don't really realize the nature of your material is actually very, very different from theirs. And there's this kind of expectation on some people's part, this assumption that maybe you shouldn't be writing about something if there isn't a huge glut of material about it. And as a classicist, I mean, my riposte to that is that actually you wouldn't write about anything in the ancient world. There's hardly any event that you have a huge amount of, you know, day by day. You don't have an hour by hour breakdown. It's not like you're writing about the Second World War and you can do a kind of countdown to each battle and show exactly how and why something happened. You don't have that luxury of material. You've got the complete opposite. And I think you have to try and make a virtue of that as a writer. I just don't have any patience with people sort of complaining about the sort of, what's the point if you don't know very much about this writer. I mean, the whole of this book that I've just written for women, we don't know, some of them, there are loads of them you don't know anything about at all. There's some of them you know 2 lines about. But I just don't think, it just doesn't seem right to me that you just ignore them just because there isn't enough on them. You know, I think you've got to make the most of what you do have. So that's probably my one gripe.
That's your gripe, your biggest beef. Okay, so we have been talking about The Missing Thread, huge and wonderful book that's taught me so much. It just sort of filled in lots of gaps in my knowledge and gave me a whole new perspective on a lot of things that I half knew about or I'd read about in Shakespeare. So thank you very much, Daisy Dunn. And well, what are you doing next? Are you resting from your labours? Are you already on to the next thing?
Well, I'm gearing up for the American publication of this first. So there's quite a lot of focus on that before I can sit down and have that kind of needed time, you know, when you're on your own by your desk with nothing else to worry about, is when you have that sort of creative thought to start a new project. So hopefully that will come in August. Or
wonderful. I can't wait to see what you do next. So thank you very much for joining me in the book bag.
Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. And yeah, wasn't that great? I so enjoyed that. The Missing Thread by Daisy Dunn. Just a wonderful story, and filled in lots of gaps that I have in my pitiful ancient world knowledge. Join me next time when I find another wonderful author to talk to. In the meantime, happy reading. Go back to your books. Goodbye.